Alrighty, welcome everyone to another exciting edition of American Studies 395. A lot of what we do in this class is talk about California as a producer of images. We've seen that in previous lectures, how California creates cultural expressions, whether it's Hollywood or Disneyland, that come to have a great influence on American culture at large. But also we talk a lot about how images of California are produced, and we've talked about that as well in many of our recent lectures, how the nation and world comes to see California. In this lecture, we're going to engage with both of those, the way in which certain images and representations come out of California and how California, in many ways, is subject to an image produced and consumed by many, seeing California in certain ways, and in particular, reinforcing stereotypes about California as a place of fringe elements, of unusual and aberrant expressions. We'll engage in those themes here today in a lecture on various cult movements that have developed in California in the late 20th century, and how these cults often are seen as representative of California influencing society because these cults reflect larger trends both in California and the nation, and also how they reinforce certain images of California as a place, again, of strange expressions, aberrants, a bizarre place there on the west coast of California. We start with probably the most well-known of these cults, the cult that surrounded Charles Manson in the late 1960s. Now, in the 1960s, California, as one of its roles as a producer of images and representations, was at the heart of key movements within the music industry and music culture. A certain California sound developed in the 1960s that often centered on groups like Jan and Dean, the Beach Boys, images of the beach culture. And then in the late 60s, the counterculture with groups like The Doors and others performing on Sunset Boulevard, the Sunset Strip. So California, in addition to television and Hollywood, was also the center of the music industry after World War II. And out of that industry came certain images, songs, themes, bands, performers who were often connected to an image of California, whether it was the beach sound of the early 60s and groups like the Beach Boys that celebrated the sunshine image of California, or the counterculture that developed in the late 60s with groups like The Doors and others that offered a more jaded image of the California dream. So you have the Los Angeles sound of the mid-60s coming out of the Sunset Strip region, and then also the beach culture, and then also another key epicenter for American music in California in the late 60s was San Francisco, the Haight Ashbury district, where you had groups like Jefferson Airplane, the Grateful Dead, and others who were really expressing that youthful rebellion we associate with the 1960s and the counterculture. So not just Los Angeles and the Sunset Strip and the music industry rooted in Los Angeles as a media center, San Francisco was also key in defining a certain genre of rock and roll music that spoke to young people. And as a result, it became a magnet for countercultural types. The Haight-Ashbury district became a place where young people would gravitate to. It was a part of California, part of San Francisco, that had a vibrant art scene. It was very sympathetic to people with unorthodox viewpoints, countercultural types, a drug scene where people could experiment with LSD and other psychedelic drugs, and in doing so shed conformity and get in touch with different ways of being and thinking. So the Haight-Ashbury district was an epicenter for the counterculture, in part because of the music scene that emanated out of San Francisco. Again, groups like Jefferson Airplane, the Grateful Dead. But more broadly, the Haight-Ashbury district was a place where people who often felt as if they didn't fit in with the conformist society of post-World War II America could find a safe harbor, could find sympathetic people like themselves. And so it became this haven for people who were part of the more rebellious spirit of the 1960s. In 1967, a key event we often associate with the counterculture, the youth rebellion of this period, the Summer of Love concert was held in San Francisco, where Jimi Hendrix and other notable performers performed for a very eager crowd of countercultural types, young people. The Summer of Love is one of these events that we still mine and draw upon to reveal the story of the 1960s, along with civil rights, feminism, the Stonewall Rebellion in 1969 that sparks the modern gay rights movement. There are these watershed flashpoint events that we often reflect upon as so revealing of some of the broader contours of this period, and the Summer of Love is often one of those watershed events that comes to define the counterculture, the youth rebellion of this period. And also drawn to the Haight Ashbury district, the Summer of Love concert, the overall countercultural sensibilities of Northern California was Charles Manson, who was a budding musician who wanted to become well known amidst the music scene within California. And he established there in Northern California in 1967 a cadre of people, young women, young men who shared the countercultural spirit, who enjoyed experimentation with drugs and the music scene, that often fell under the thrall and influence of Manson, who was rather diminutive, a short man, but very powerful in his persona and his ability to charismatically appeal to young people like himself who were drawn to the countercultural scene. And this group became known as his family. He often advanced this idea that his group, that we may call a cult, was really a family. And what that symbolized was a sense of belonging, meaning, identity. A lot of the young people who gravitated to Manson were runaways who had lost connection with their actual families or felt alienated from their parents and other adults in their life. And they found in this group surrounding Charlie a lot of meaning and identity. Eventually, Manson and his family come to Los Angeles because, again, Charles Manson, we often forget because he's so associated with the murders that he inspired and helped execute. Charles Manson wanted to be a musician, and that's why he was in Los Angeles. He came here to make contacts with the industry. He believed that if people could hear his music, that he would eventually receive the attention and fame that he craved. And so he comes to Los Angeles, and he starts to mingle in the music scene, and he makes friends with prominent musicians based on his charismatic personality, his dogged determination to be part of this music scene, and overall the spirit of openness that prevailed within the music scene, the counterculture in California, in Los Angeles in the 1960s. And as a result of this, he was able to come and live with Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys in his Malibu home. So Charlie Manson moves in with Dennis Wilson and brings with him his cadre of young people, young women, young men who were part of his family. And Wilson, as a friend of Charlie, as an associate, was sympathetic in many ways to Manson's efforts to get recognition for his music. And in his home recording studio, in his house in Malibu, he recorded some of Manson's songs. And so the recordings we have of Charles Manson and the songs that he wrote are really because of his friendship with Dennis Wilson. And Manson wanted to send these to a number of prominent musicians and music executives. He eventually sent copies to John Lennon and others who, after the murders, realized that they had these recordings from now the notorious Charles Manson. So his friendship with Dennis Wilson, living there in his Malibu house, was for Charlie the conduit for finally receiving recognition and acclaim for his own musicianship. But eventually he wore out his welcome, and he antagonized Dennis Wilson. A lot of this had to do with the drug use going on in the home, as well as the difficulties associated with Manson. And so eventually he and Dennis Wilson get into a fight. Wilson kicks him out of the home. And Charlie Manson, of course, took this as a great slight, a great insult, as well as a missed opportunity to receive the acclaim that he so sought. And he becomes increasingly angry and unhinged, but also becomes increasingly committed to building up this family of his, appealing to other disaffected, angry young people. And so he continues to exert the sort of charismatic appeal towards young runaways who had come to Los Angeles, seeking a different way of life, fleeing their families, and finding meaning and connection in Manson's family. At this point, when Manson and his group are kicked out of the Malibu home of Dennis Wilson, they have sort of a peripatetic existence within Southern California, within Los Angeles, moving about the county, squatting at different places, and eventually they come to squat at the Spahn Ranch in Topanga Canyon. Now, the ranch had been used by Hollywood studios for a long time, for decades, as a backdrop for the many westerns that were produced before, during, and after World War II, during the heyday of the Hollywood Western. So the Topanga Ranch, the Spahn Ranch, was frequented, well known as a filming site. But by the 1960s, westerns had now ebbed in popularity. It was the age of the counterculture. It was an age that was very critical of a lot of the values of martial power, masculinity that westerns exhibited. So in an anti-Vietnam era, gunfighters and the more, again, militaristic sensibilities of westerns were now out of favor. And so the Spahn Ranch wasn't being utilized. There weren't many westerns being made by Hollywood in the 60s. Westerns weren't really being produced for TV any longer. So it was largely abandoned, and Charlie and his family found safe harbor there. They experimented with drugs. Manson pursued his music. They had this very communal living. The owner of the Spahn Ranch engaged in sexual relations with a lot of the young girls in Manson's group as sort of a way of allowing Manson to squat there, sort of a compensation of sorts, which is rather disgusting and revolting, but this is what Charlie did. He convinced these young girls to sleep with the elderly owner of the Spahn Ranch. And so they briefly had this moment where now they were inhabiting the Spahn Ranch in Topanga. During this time, Charles Manson becomes obsessed with the Beatles' White Album, and in particular, the song Helter Skelter, which is actually about a slide. It's about playground equipment, Helter Skelter. This is a British term for, a twisty slide you might find on a playground. But Manson finds in this song this sort of cryptic call for a race war, where blacks and whites will be pitted against each other. It will lead to this violent clash and the end of American civilization as we know it. So he begins to interpret this as the Beatles speaking to Charles Manson, that John Lennon in Helter Skelter is trying to appeal to Charles Manson and give him this template that will lead to a race war and eventually the end of American civilization as we know it. And so Manson, thus convinced that this song is a direct appeal to him and a call to spark such a race war, decides that he will help spark this by creating violence, associating the violence with African Americans, knowing that will lead to this reprisal by whites, and then you'll have the race war that he believed was prophesized in Helter Skelter. Now, there were African Americans who were living with the Manson family out at the Spahn Ranch, and at one point, Charlie got into a conflict with one of these young African American men, and he kills the African American drug dealer who was there with the community at the Spahn Ranch, and that seems to have had an effect on Charlie Manson, and for him was his first act of revolutionary violence that would in the end spark this race war between whites and blacks. And so in the summer of 1969, under the direction of Charlie Manson, in an effort to spark this race war, He planned on murdering wealthy white people in Bel Air and then making it look like the murders had been completed by the Black Panthers or some sort of violent, dissident African American group, knowing that the white community in Los Angeles would be alarmed that these African Americans were killing wealthy whites, and they would retaliate, and you would get eventually an escalation of racial conflict and the apocalyptic end to it all that Manson heard in the lyrics of Helter Skelter. So in August of 1969, he instructed members of his cult, his family, to murder residents of a large home in Benedict Canyon, an elite, wealthy area of Los Angeles. Among those who were killed, Sharon Tate, a movie star and the wife of the famed movie director Roman Polanski, who would go on to direct films like Rosemary's Baby and Chinatown. Sharon Tate was 8 months pregnant at the time, and so she was killed, as well as, of course, her unborn child. The members of Manson's group, the young women and men who participated in these killings, smeared blood on the walls of this mansion in Bel Air and Benedict Canyon, with slogans like "Death to Pigs" and others that again were designed to blame the murders on radical African Americans who were waging this war against whites. Also killed were wealthy heirs to the Folgers coffee fortune. And then the next night, members of Manson's family cult killed Lino and Rosemary LaBianca, who were the owners of a chain of grocery stores in Los Angeles, and also very wealthy. So you have the Manson Murders in the summer of 1969, all again the product of Charlie's deranged interpretations of the Beatles song Helter Skelter, in an effort to create violence, kill wealthy whites, blame it on African Americans, and spark the race war. A couple images here of Manson and the members of his group known as the Family. On the left, some of the young women who were part of Manson's group, many of whom were ordered by Manson to kill Sharon Tate and the LaBiancas and others who were victims of their violence. During the trial, they shaved their heads. Here in this photograph, you can see their hair starting to grow back. And they became emblematic for many who are following this trial of the counterculture, of young people who were unhinged and violent, and very symbolic for many older Americans watching this as all that's wrong with the youth rebellion of the 1960s. These young women who killed people or accused of killing, who really represented the threats of a generation unhinged in the minds of many. On the right, there's Charles Manson as part of his trial when he was tried in Superior Court in downtown LA for the murders. And he appeared in court, often in this self-styled way as this guru of sorts, this intellectual type, even though, of course, his mind was so addled from drug use. And, of course, he was culpable, responsible for these killings that he participated in and ordered young people to ultimately execute. So in 1969, soon after the killings of the LaBiancas, Sharon Tate, and others, Manson and his family are arrested. A trial is held that really riveted the attention of the nation and the world because it was seen as so emblematic of the worst fears of the counterculture, the youth movement. In March of 1971, Charles Manson was convicted for his role in the murders and sentenced to death. But he would not be executed because in February of 1972, the California Supreme Court suspended the death penalty, and all those who had been convicted prior and sentenced to death would have their death sentences instead switched to life in prison sentences. And that's why Charles Manson, though he was convicted of his role in the murders, though he was ordered to be executed, never was executed and would instead die in prison. He died very recently. He lived for many decades after the murders, became notorious, infamous, was often on television being interviewed by Geraldo Rivera and others. He lived for many decades afterwards because California in the 1970s ended the death penalty, and those who had been sentenced to death had their sentences switched to life in prison sentences. When California returns to the death penalty, those who had their sentences switched to life in prison weren't then again returned to death sentences, and so Manson lived for many, many decades after. And as I said, Manson doesn't go away. He remains in the spotlight in many ways. He became the focus of documentaries, of many books. He often appeared on television in interview segments. It was part of the sensationalist journalism of that period where Geraldo Rivera and others would get great ratings for their TV programs by going and interviewing Charles Manson, who would say all kinds of bizarre things, always plead that he was innocent, that he didn't kill anyone, that these young people did this on their own. At one point during his time in prison, he slashed a swastika into his forehead, and so here he was on cable news appearing, making all these wild statements, increasingly unhinged with a swastika on his face. It was really the worst of tabloid media journalism in that period, and it meant that the Haight family, the LaBianca family, the Folger family had to endure Charles Manson quite often appearing in the news. One of the members of Manson's family that wasn't sentenced in the murders of 1969, Lynette Squeaky, as her nickname, Fromm, became famous in the 1970s because she was one of a few who took an assassination attempt on President Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford becomes president after Nixon, our old friend, Orange County's own Richard Nixon from previous lectures. When he resigns as president, the Watergate scandal, his vice president, Gerald Ford, took over. And Ford endured a number of assassination attempts. And one of them was staged by Squeaky Fromm. Of course, she wasn't successful. But it was, again, a moment in the 1970s, years after the 69 murders, where it seemed like, once again, the Manson family was haunting America and returning in this way. Charles Manson came up for parole throughout his time in prison. And again, that was a moment for the family of those who had been victimized by him to have to return to the trauma of the murders because they appeared at the parole hearings, not just for Manson, but other members of his group who were sentenced and then sought parole. Family members, including Sharon Tate's sister, who has been very active in the effort to make sure none of the family members are ever paroled, would of course appear at the parole hearings and give their testimony. So though the murders and the trial were all finally completed by the early 70s, the legacy of the Manson murders continues in so many ways, not just in the real lives of the people involved in the events, but of course in our popular culture, in media, in many ways, both documentary revisitations of the murders, and then, like you see in the recent Quentin Tarantino film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, fictionalized accounts of this. So there's something about the Manson murders that we keep coming back to. It's, again, an image emanating out of California that seems to have a captive hold, even now 50 years after the murders. Another consequence of the murders, and this too is part of the reason why it continues to be so, they continue to be so prominent in our culture, is that many reflecting on what this was and why it happened and what it means came to see the Manson murders as, again, so demonstrative of some of the larger contours and for many the worst elements of the youth culture and the counterculture of the 1960s. And they cite this as sort of the end of the promise of that era of civil rights, of feminism, of gay rights, of some of the more noble ideals of the 60s that were trying to create greater peace, greater harmony, greater social advancement for people who had long been, again, subject to racism and discrimination. The larger ideals of the 60s were shattered by many by this final event in the late summer of 1969 that seemed to represent the death of that moment of promise, and instead a period where those promises would go unfulfilled and lead to the 1970s, which, as we talked about, was a very reactionary time, a grim time. Last week we talked about this idea of the post-industrial decline, the sense that the California dream was now outside one's grasp. We talked about the 1970s and the subcultures of skate and punk that still represented that more dim noir vision of California. And so the Manson murders, along with another incident that occurred in California in the late 60s, there was a concert that was held in Northern California where the Rolling Stones and other groups performed, and violence broke out, and a young man was stabbed to death on camera because this concert was being filmed as part of a documentary called Gimme Shelter about the Rolling Stones at the Altamont Speedway in Northern California, about 60 miles east of San Francisco. So there are these two acts of violence associated with the music scene, the counterculture, the Altamont massacre, the killings of Manson. And a lot of people see those events because they happened in 1969, at the very end of the 60s, as sort of pivot points where the great ideals of the 60s ultimately instead descended into violence, and you get the gritty, grim, reactionary, conservative 1970s era that we've talked about in previous lectures, that is often seen as sort of where the dreams of the 60s went to die. So another consequence of the Manson murders is the way in which it continues to influence our historical imagination, how we imagine this period in California history and American history. Many see the Manson murders as the end of the promise of the 60s, the end of that sunshine era of California, and the fulcrum or pivot point into the sort of grim and darker realities of the 1970s. Another key cult that is associated with modern California history, one that becomes renowned, famous, infamous, I should say, and part of our daily vocabulary in many ways, concerns Jim Jones. Jim Jones, as a young man, was a preacher, a minister in Indiana, and he had sort of radical viewpoints. He was an open communist, and this was in the 1950s when you had the height of McCarthyism and the Red Scare, which we talked about. He was a radical in his open, avowed support of communism, and also as a strong supporter of civil rights and the rights of African Americans. And so he integrated his church. He and his wife became the very first white couple in the state of Indiana to be legally able to adopt an African American orphan child. And this was part of Jones's early image of his religious movement as one of a rainbow family of people from various backgrounds coming together, worshiping Christ, and creating a better, more harmonious world here on earth. In 1965, Jones left Indiana, and he first came to California and created the very first version of the People's Temple. Now, the name itself, again, speaks to this idea of societal harmony, of a religious movement of the many, of the people, as well as its connotations about communism as well. He comes to Northern California, and he becomes increasingly convinced that humanity is doomed and that we're headed to a nuclear apocalypse. Again, this is the Cold War era and the height of such fears about the bomb. And he wanted to create a counter movement to what he saw as the depravity of modern American life, and as well the escalation of a Cold War that would likely lead to human destruction. He wanted to create what he described as a sort of socialist Eden, where everyone lived together in harmony, shared resources, where poverty was eradicated. So rather than being an avowed communist, he instead stylized himself as a socialist. And his group, the People's Temple, were very unorthodox, particularly in an age, as we've talked about in previous lectures, as you read about in the Ariano book, where the modern conservative movement is beginning, evangelical Christianity, the birth of the religious right. Jones's Christianity is very different. It was, again, openly socialist in its politics and advocacy. Jones was very critical of traditional Christianity, seeing it again as a tool of white supremacy and capitalism. He was very different than Robert Schuller and the evangelical movements we read about in the Ariano book that were very compatible with capitalism and conservative politics. The People's Temple, its first iteration, created a variety of aid programs that sought to provide preschool education for children, clothing and food assistance, and he offered this very, again, harmonious message that sought to create this community of worshipers that shared resources, where race and other lines of division melted away, a true people's temple in that sense. And many people were drawn to Jim Jones because his message fit with a lot of the ideals of the 60s, the counterculture, anti-racist, expressing a vision of harmony. Many in the counterculture were drawn to his arguments against capitalism and the wasteful consumerism that prevailed in California and in America in the post-World War II period. He wanted to share resources. He wanted to say there are different ways of creating human worth and value beyond materialism. And he really worked to that end with the various programs that were established. So this is really the moment where Jim Jones is most folded into the mainstream of California society in the late 60s. He becomes sort of another figure within the high-minded cultural ideals of this era, the counterculture, with his emphasis, again, on racial harmony, on social movements, on economic justice. He was a figure who became increasingly prominent within Northern California because his message was so appealing. And eventually he became much more active in local and community politics and appeared at city council meetings. And so Jim Jones was another key figure that represented a lot of these social movements that we associate with California in the 1960s. In 1975, the People's Temple established a home in San Francisco. So again, one of those key epicenters of the ideals of this period. And Jones fit right in with the remnants and continuing efforts of the counterculture that had flowered in San Francisco in the late 60s, early 70s. His activism in politics, his role within the community, the various social programs, community programs that he established in the People's Temple, led to him being appointed the chairman of the Housing Authority Commission for the city of San Francisco. So again, this is really a moment where Jones is a mainstream figure within now the political structure of the city of San Francisco. Prominent California politicians, prominent national politicians praised Jim Jones because of his anti-poverty efforts, his social programs, the educational programs that he established that were doing real, tangible, good things for the people of this community, and for his rhetoric, which again was very harmonious in its verbiage, its words, appealing to, again, racial harmony. And so Walter Mondale, who will go on to be Vice President of the United States, elected in 1976. Rosalind Carter, who will go on to be First Lady when her husband Jimmy Carter is victorious in that 1976 presidential campaign. Willie Brown, who was a prominent figure within San Francisco and state politics, eventually the mayor of San Francisco, all praised Jim Jones and were photographed with him, photographs that would later become quite notorious when Jim Jones is responsible for the mass suicide we know as Jonestown. He appeared regularly on local television in San Francisco in profiles that were very praising, fawning of this very charismatic preacher, minister, who represented a different vision of organized religion than had prevailed here in this period of the rise of evangelical Christianity associated with conservative politics. So the People's Temple really became an institution within San Francisco in the mid-1970s. But increasingly, it attracted people who were often radical in their politics and seized the prominence of Jones to advance their agenda. As well, there were problems within the temple when members of this religious community were charged with various forms of abuse of the worshipers there within the People's Temple. Members of the flock who were subject to sexual, physical, and emotional abuse. There are allegations that Jim Jones was profiting from the temple personally, despite his rhetoric of socialism, of anti-poverty campaigns, of him as a humble man seeking to help the impoverished of now post-industrial decline San Francisco. So what shatters Jones's prominence and leads ultimately to him fleeing the nation were a series of scandals where members of the People's Temple came forward and shattered that image of Jones as a noble, altruistic figure. Instead, he was accused of very heinous acts of abuse. And this ultimately led Jones to flee the United States and establish a community known as Jonestown in Guyana, a nation in South America, former British colony. He eventually established another version of the People's Temple, now outside the United States, because he feared arrest and prosecution for the various illegalities and abuses he was charged with by a series of revelations that came forward into the media by members of the temple. And so in 1977, Jim Jones and the still loyal members of his community fled to Guyana. And there he would create what he hoped to be his socialist paradise without the interference, scrutiny of what he saw as the institutions of authority and power that he blamed for the false charges he claimed against him, the conspiracy to thwart the ambitions of creating the socialist paradise. In Guyana, he believed he was free to do that. But he continued to be subject to a lot of scrutiny. Members of the temple continued to come forward with revelations. There was pressure on politicians representing that district, representing California in the federal government, in the U.S. House of Representatives, to hold Jones accountable and not let him basically get away with fleeing the country. So when Jones flees the country, that seems to validate the idea that he is guilty. Why would he flee? Of course, he argues he's doing it to be free to pursue his socialist paradise. But for many, it was a marker of guilt. And that led to further scrutiny, more allegations, and eventually a U.S. congressman representing the district, the People's Temple in San Francisco, was located there within. A U.S. congressman in the U.S. House of Representatives, Leo Ryan, says, well, I'm going to go down to Guyana and investigate what's going on. Members of my district, my constituents have come forward with these allegations. In particular, Ryan was concerned that so many of the people in his district had gone with Jones to Guyana, and they were endangered, imperiled there. There's a lot of pressure on Ryan from members of the People's Temple who had left the movement, who said, my relatives, my friends are still in the movement. They're in Guyana and they're in danger. Or those who were not members of the People's Temple but were relatives of those who were, who said, he's brainwashed these people, he's manipulative, he's convinced them to, join with him. And so all of these appeals led to Ryan going to see the People's Temple. And initially when Ryan appears, Jim Jones welcomes him in and puts on a big show. Everyone's happy. This is, our effort here in Guyana to create a true society of equality. And so he lets Ryan in. He gives him access to the community. it seems like Jones is very amenable to this investigation. But when Ryan's there, members of the Jonestown community in Guyana come forward and they confess to him that they have been held against their will, that they're being denied a chance to leave. And so Ryan is informed by the people within the Jonestown community that Jim Jones is indeed using very coercive measures to compel them to remain, and continues to physically abuse the members of this community. And so now Ryan knows. And he and his group go back to the helipad where their helicopter landed, and he's going to go back to the United States. And before he's allowed to leave, Jim Jones orders members of his community to go and kill Leo Ryan and members of his group who had come to investigate Jonestown. So now Jim Jones is directly responsible for the assassination of an American congressman. And he knows that they're going to come for him. And so later that day, he mixes up a batch of Flavor Aid. Now, I mentioned earlier that Jonestown becomes part of our lexicon, part of our vocabulary, because you often hear this phrase today, drinking the Kool-Aid, right? As someone who is, like a cultist figure who does whatever he's told and follows in lockstep with the demands of some sort of charismatic leader. But that's really a misnomer because it wasn't Kool-Aid that they used. It was Flavor Aid, sort of a second-rate knockoff of the better-known Kool-Aid. They mix Flavor Aid with poison, and Jim Jones goes on the public address system there at Guyana, and he orders the members of his community, then a little bit over 900, to first give the poison to their children, to kill their children, and then drink it themselves. And they commit mass suicide in what Jones called a protest. We're going to kill ourselves. We're going to do so in protest because the world has conspired to deny the righteous, godly community we're creating here. So Jim Jones himself would commit suicide to avoid arrest and prosecution for the various crimes he was culpable of, including ordering the assassination of Leo Ryan. But before he commits suicide, he orders members of his group to commit suicide. And so Jonestown would end in this mass suicide under the direction of Jim Jones. There's a couple images of this. I don't want to linger too much because it's so disturbing. But you can see here what the world saw when helicopters flew over Jonestown, when it became known that Leo Ryan had been killed and wasn't coming back. And this is what they discovered, a rather grim scene. Let's end our survey of cults by talking about one last example of cults within California in the late 20th century. And this one was known as Heaven's Gate. It was founded by Marshall Applewhite, who was sort of a fringe figure of the counterculture, who had a variety of commitments to New Age crystals and other kind of silly falderall. He, in the late 70s, claimed to have a near-death experience, and there he received a revelation about the impending end of the world. He eventually formed his own group called Heaven's Gate, and they became convinced of that vision that Doe, as he became known, Marshall Applewhite, took on the name Doe, D-O, which of course was great fodder for all kinds of Homer Simpson jokes after the Heaven's Gate mass suicide. People wondered about how to pronounce it. Is it Doe or Doe? Doe, as he became known, believed that he had prophesied the end of the world, and many people here within California gravitated to his own charismatic appeal and his prophecy that the earth was doomed and we had to be ready to leave Earth and prepare for it to be, as he called, recycled. So it's a very California thing, right? Earth is going to be recycled, right? That the earth was doomed as we have it now, that it will be destroyed, but will be turned into a new earth that we can return to once that recycling has happened. Another key part of Heaven's Gate was this idea that all of this is being orchestrated, the recycling of Earth, by aliens. And so they believed in extraterrestrials, and this was very vogue in the late 20th century. After the Cold War, in the early 1990s, America sort of found a new boogeyman, and there was a lot of obsession with aliens and alien abductions, and you had prominent shows like X-Files, and this is really the beginning of what's returned now, this kind of obsession with Roswell and Area 51. So Doe was very much in line with that late 90s obsession with aliens and extraterrestrials. Eventually, Heaven's Gate became known, infamous, because in March of 1997, the members of this group were found to have committed mass suicide in a home in a very affluent part of northern San Diego County. They had rented this home and committed suicide within this home because they believed that the end of the earth, this imminent recycling of the earth, was almost immediate, and that in order to escape Earth, they could catch a ride on the Hale-Bopp comet. Now, in 1997, the Hale-Bopp comet was very close to the Earth. You could see it with your naked eye. You didn't need a telescope. You could walk right out. I can remember this myself as a very, 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 very young man in 1997, because I'm so young and vigorous, having been born in 19... I remember this. You know, I would come home after work or school, and I would see right there in the eye, in the sky with the naked eye, the Hale-Bopp comet. So this really captured the attention of Americans, this very close visitation of the Hale-Bopp comet. And Doe convinces his followers that if we commit suicide now, we can catch a ride on the comet, and then we'll come back to Earth once it's recycled. So they put poison in little packets of pudding, like you'd have in your school lunch. And they ate the pudding and committed suicide. But before they died, they sat down in bunk beds, all dressed alike, wearing the same brand of Nike sneakers, covering their bodies with shrouds. And then it was later discovered that they all had the exact change, the exact amount of $5.75 in their pockets, which evidently was the bus fare to ride the Hale-Bopp comet. So part of what made Heaven's Gate so fascinating were these images that came out of that very affluent rented home in northern San Diego, where you had these 38 people all dressed alike, all covered in shrouds, all wearing the pair of Nike sneakers that were often associated with hip-hop culture in this period, and all having $5.75 in their pockets. It had all these bizarre elements to it. Here on the left is that image of the 38 people who were throughout the house in bunk beds, dressed in this way. On the right, there is Marshall Applewhite, or as he was known, Doe, in a videotape testimonial that later became available after the mass suicide, where he revealed all of his cockamamie ideas about the end of the earth and capturing a ride on the comet and why his people were committing suicide. So we've walked through a number of stories here. Manson, Jonestown, and now Heaven's Gate, that all take place within California in the 70s, 80s, 90s. The story of the cults of California in the late 20th century. And we've stressed throughout this lecture how, whether it's Manson and the counterculture, the music scene, the youth culture, Jones, and as well the noble ideals of San Francisco politics and racial harmony, and then later, even Heaven's Gate, so aberrant and strange, was also kind of part of the apocalyptic viewpoints of the end of the 20th century, Y2K, alien obsessions. All of these cults, though we often think of them as so aberrant and strange and bizarre and anomalies, the product of charismatic figures who had this control over people's minds, they were all, though, also reflective of broad trends in each of these periods, whether it's Manson and the counterculture, Jim Jones and the ideals of racial harmony and progressive politics, or Heaven's Gate and the late 90s obsession with aliens, apocalypse, the end of the world, millennial fears of Y2K. All of these cults are reflective of those trends. We began this lecture by saying here we're going to talk once again about California as a producer of images, but also one that is often subject to images. And all of these cults reflect certain stereotypes about California as a den of loonies and wackos and, fringe element there on the left coast. But, all of these communities, as they could often be derisively seen as cults in that fashion, also, again, speak to movements in California that often want to break free from a homogenous culture, create something unique and different, even though most of these, if not all of them, turn into tragic ends. They represent kind of that California dream in a very perverse and strange way, to live a life of one's own making. Manson, Jones, Applewhite, they all had this sort of vision of themselves as in the vanguard of change, as prophets of sorts. And so there's a weird way in which these cults reflect kind of notions of California as a place where your dreams come true in many ways, where you could live a life of your own making, where you're in charge of your destiny, even though, as we've seen here, the ultimate end of all of these communities was a tragic one. So there's a lot here. These aren't just strange stories of California in the late 20th century. They are very reflective of some of the broad themes in the class.